The sun hung low over the vast, golden plains, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple as evening settled upon the land. A quiet wind rustled through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of earth and wildflowers. In the middle of this great expanse stood a small wooden ranch house, its walls weathered by years of sun and storm. This was the home of Thomas, a man whose hands were rough from labor and whose heart carried the weight of solitude. He had once dreamed of a bustling homestead, filled with laughter and family, but time and hardship had whittled his world down to just two souls his own, and that of his daughter, Lily. Lily was a girl of 12, with hair the color of wheat and a voice as soft as the creek that ran behind their house. She had been blind since birth, but her fingers knew the shape of every object in their home, and her ears recognized the songs of every bird that perched on their fence. Though she had never seen the sunrise, she could describe its warmth better than anyone. Thomas loved her more than anything in this world, but he feared what would become of her when he was no longer there to protect her. The nearest town was miles away, and the people there were wary of outsiders, especially a blind girl who could not work the way others could. Each morning, Thomas rose before dawn to tend to the cattle and mend fences, while Lily hummed old tunes and fed the chickens, her small hands moving with practiced ease. The animals trusted her, coming close without fear, as if they sensed the kindness in her spirit. Thomas often watched her from a distance, his chest tight with both pride and sorrow. She deserved more than this lonely life, but he didn't know how to give it to her. Then, one evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars blinked awake, a sound cut through the stillness, a cry of pain, raw and desperate, coming from the woods beyond the pasture. Thomas froze, his grip tightening on the pitchfork he had been leaning against. It wasn't the cry of an animal. It was human. For a moment he hesitated. The woods were no place to wander after dark, and the settlers in the nearby town had whispered for months about Comanche warriors roaming the land. The Comanche and the settlers were not friends. There had been raids, stolen cattle, and worse. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and Thomas knew he couldn't ignore it. Leaving Lily with strict orders to bolt the door behind him, he grabbed his rifle and a lantern and set off toward the trees. The light flickered as he pushed through the underbrush, his boots crunching on dry leaves. The sound guided him, a ragged breathing, the occasional groan. And then he saw him. A young man, no older than 20, lay half-hidden in the brush, his leg trapped in the jagged teeth of a rusted bear trap. His dark eyes locked onto Thomas's, filled with pain and defiance. The fringed leather of his clothing, the beads woven into his braided hair, Thomas didn't need to ask who he was. This was a Comanche warrior. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The warrior's hand twitched toward the knife at his belt, but the pain was too great. Thomas could have turned away. No one would have blamed him. But as he looked into the young man's eyes, he didn't see an enemy. He saw someone's son, bleeding and alone. With a slow, deliberate motion, Thomas set down his rifle and knelt beside him. The warrior flinched, but didn't fight as Thomas pried open the trap's jaws, freeing his leg. The wound was deep, and the man would not be able to walk far. Thomas knew what he had to do. "Can you understand me?" he asked. The warrior gave a slight nod. "I'm going to help you," Thomas said. "But you have to promise me no harm will come to my home, to my daughter." The young man studied him for a long moment before speaking in a voice rough with pain. "No harm," he agreed. And with that, Thomas hoisted him up, supporting his weight as they made the slow, painful journey back to the ranch where Lily waited, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls of the small ranch house as Thomas carefully cleaned the warrior's wound. The young Comanche man, Takoda, sat rigid on the edge of the cot, his jaw clenched against the sting of the whiskey Thomas used to disinfect the torn flesh. His dark eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail: the worn wooden table, the cast-iron stove, the rifle mounted above the doorway. He was a stranger here, surrounded by the unfamiliar smells of smoke, dried herbs, and the faint scent of bread from that morning's baking. His fingers flexed slightly at his sides, as if ready to reach for a weapon that was no longer there. Thomas had removed it along with the knife, though he had placed them just out of reach rather than locking them away. A small gesture of trust, or perhaps just caution. From the corner of the room, where she sat in her rocking chair, Lily tilted her head toward the sound of Takoda's uneven breathing. She had been quiet since Thomas brought him inside, listening intently as her father explained in hushed tones that there was a hurt man in their home, a man from the Comanche people. She had heard stories about them, of course. The folks in town spoke of raids and stolen horses, of warriors who could move like ghosts across the plains. But the man before her didn't sound like a ghost. He sounded like someone in pain. "Does it hurt very much?" she asked suddenly, her voice gentle. Takoda stiffened, surprised that she had addressed him directly. He studied her face, the way her unseeing eyes didn't quite meet his, the way her hands rested lightly on the arms of the chair, fingers tracing the grooves in the wood. She was blind. He hadn't realized that at first. "It is bearable," he said after a moment, his words deliberate. His English was rough but clear, learned from traders and trappers who sometimes crossed paths with his people. Thomas finished wrapping the wound in clean bandages and stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You won't be walking on that for a few days," he said gruffly. "You can stay here until you're healed enough to travel. But no trouble." Takoda gave a single nod. He had no intention of causing trouble, not yet at least. But he was wary. These were settlers, men who had taken land that once belonged to his people. Men who would shoot a Comanche on sight, if given the chance. Yet this one had helped him.
Why?
The answer came sooner than he expected. As night deepened and Thomas went outside to check on the livestock, Takoda found himself alone with Lily. The firelight painted her face in warm gold as she turned toward him. "Do you know any stories?" she asked. Takoda blinked. "Stories?"
Yes.
"My father tells me some, but he's heard the same ones all his life. I like new stories." For the first time since he had been brought into this house, Takoda felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Stories were something he understood. Around the fires of his village, elders passed down tales of heroes and spirits, of how the world came to be. Hesitantly, he began to speak not a grand legend, but a simple one, about a coyote who outsmarted a bear. Lily listened intently, her face lighting up at the clever twists in the tale. When he finished, she clapped her hands together. "That's wonderful. Can you teach me to say something in your language?" Takoda hesitated, then spoke a few words in Comanche, slow and clear. Lily repeated them carefully, her tongue shaping the unfamiliar sounds with surprising accuracy. A faint smile touched his lips. When Thomas returned, he paused in the doorway, watching the unlikely pair, his blind daughter laughing as Takoda taught her another phrase. The warrior's earlier wariness softened into something almost like amusement. For a moment, the weight on Thomas's chest eased. Maybe this wouldn't end in bloodshed after all. But outside, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the distant howl of a wolf, a reminder that the world beyond these walls was not so simple. And in the town miles away, men would soon be wondering why Thomas had missed Sunday's gathering.
Questions would be asked.
And questions in times like these were dangerous. The morning sun stretched long fingers of light across the ranch yard as Thomas stepped out onto the porch, his breath curling in the crisp autumn air. He had slept little, his mind turning over the risks of sheltering Takoda. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind had seemed like a warning. Now, in the pale dawn, the world felt too quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Inside, Lily moved about the kitchen, her hands sure as she set the table for breakfast. She hummed softly, the melody weaving with the crackle of the fire in the stove. Takoda sat near the hearth, his injured legs stretched out before him, watching her with an expression Thomas couldn't quite decipher. There was curiosity there, and something else, something like respect. The warrior had said little since waking, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. Thomas poured himself a cup of bitter black coffee, the heat seeping into his chilled fingers. He needed to ride into town today for supplies: flour, salt, maybe a length of cloth for Lily's winter dress. but the thought twisted his stomach. If anyone suspected he was hiding a Comanche under his roof, he glanced at Takoda, who met his gaze steadily. No, he couldn't leave him here alone with Lily. Not yet. The decision was taken from him before he could make it. The distant sound of hoofbeats cut through the morning stillness, and Thomas stiffened. Visitors were rare, and never this early. Setting his cup down with a thud, he strode to the window, his pulse quickening as 3 riders came into view: Harlan, the blacksmith, Micah, the general store owner, and Reverend Cole, his broad-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his stern face. Thomas swore under his breath. There was no time to hide Takoda. Lily, sensing the shift in the air, tilted her head. "Father? Stay inside," Thomas said, his voice low. He shot Takoda a warning look. The warrior's hand had gone to the empty space at his belt where his knife usually rested, his muscles coiled like a spring. "Not a sound," Thomas added, then stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. The men reined in their horses just beyond the porch, dust settling around them. Harlan, a burly man with a beard streaked with gray, nodded in greeting, though his eyes were sharp as they flicked to the house. "Morning, Thomas. You missed services yesterday." Reverend was concerned. Thomas forced a smile, leaning against the porch rail with what he hoped looked like casual ease. "Had some fence repairs that couldn't wait. You know how it is." Reverend Cole dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a thud. "We all make time for the Lord, Thomas." His gaze lingered on the house. "Lily well?" "She's fine. Just fixing breakfast." Thomas crossed his arms, willing his voice to stay even. "What brings you all out this way?" Micah, a thin man with a perpetual squint, shifted in his saddle. "Heard some talk. A few of the Johnson boys swear they saw Comanche tracks near the creek. Just wanted to make sure you hadn't seen anything." Thomas's mouth went dry. Behind him, the house was silent, but he could feel Takoda's presence like a shadow at his back. "Haven't seen a thing," he said, "but I'll keep an eye out." Harlan grunted. "You ought to be careful, Thomas. Especially with Lily. Those savages wouldn't think twice about." "I can handle my own," Thomas cut in, sharper than he intended. A beat of silence passed. The Reverend's eyes narrowed slightly, but he only nodded. "Well, we'll be on our way. You're welcome to join us for supper in town next week." Thomas nodded, relief trickling through him as the men turned their horses. But just as they began to ride off, a sound cut through the air, a soft thump from inside the house, like something being knocked over. All 3 men froze. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. Behind him, the door creaked open slightly, and Lily's voice floated out, bright and deliberate. "Father, the coffee's boiling over." The tension shattered. Harlan chuckled, and Micah shook his head. Reverend Cole gave a final nod before nudging his horse forward. Thomas waited until they were well down the trail before letting out a shaky breath and turning back to the house. Inside, Lily stood by the table, her face pale. Takoda was nowhere to be seen until Thomas spotted the edge of a boot protruding from behind the pantry curtain. The warrior had moved silently, swiftly, at the first sign of danger. Thomas sank into a chair, running a hand over his face. That had been too close. But as he looked at Lily, her small hands clenched in her skirts, he realized something worse. The men would be back. And next time, they might not be so easily fooled. Takoda stepped out from his hiding place, his dark eyes meeting Thomas's. "I should go," he said quietly. Lily's breath hitched. "But your leg. It's not safe for you if I stay." Thomas exhaled slowly. He knew Takoda was right. But as he looked at his daughter's stricken face, he also knew that sending the warrior away now might break something in her, something tender and hopeful that had begun to grow in the shadow of their loneliness. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest hint of wood smoke, as if somewhere, far across the plains, another fire was burning, waiting. The prairie stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth whole, the golden grasses rippling like a restless sea as Takoda rode toward the distant smudge of smoke that marked his village. His leg still ached where the bear trap's teeth had torn into flesh, but the pain was nothing compared to the tightness in his chest. He had left at first light, slipping away before Lily could wake and plead with him to stay. Thomas had said nothing as they exchanged a final nod at the door, just a silent understanding that their fragile peace could shatter at any moment. The wind carried the scent of sage and burning cedar as he neared the outskirts of the encampment, the familiar shapes of buffalo-hide teepees rising like sentinels against the horizon. Children playing near the stream paused to stare as he passed, their laughter dying into whispers. Warriors seated around low fires turned their heads, their expressions unreadable. Word traveled fast. Takoda had been gone longer than expected, and now he returned empty-handed, with no stolen horses or scalps to show for his absence. Worse, he smelled of smoke and sweat, of the white man's soap and the closed-in walls of a settler's house. He dismounted stiffly outside his father's lodge, steeling himself before pushing aside the flap. The air inside was thick with the scent of smoked meat and dried herbs, the firelight casting long shadows across the lined face of Chief Ahanu, who sat cross-legged on a woven mat, his pipe resting in one hand. The chief's eyes, dark and sharp as flint, lifted to meet his son's. "You were not at the council last night," Ahanu said, his voice low. Takoda knelt, bowing his head. "I was injured. A trap in the woods." A murmur ran through the elders seated around the fire. One of them, Gray Fox, a man with a scar running from brow to chin, leaned forward. "And who found you?" Takoda hesitated only a breath. "A settler. He took me into his home." The lodge erupted in voices sharp, disbelieving. Gray Fox spat into the fire. "You let one of them touch you? Tend to you like a child." Ahanu raised a hand, and the room fell silent. His gaze never left Takoda's face. "Why would this man help you?" Takoda exhaled slowly. "He has a daughter. Blind. She spoke to me as if I were not a stranger." He paused, then lifted his chin. "I wish to marry her." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Gray Fox's lip curled, but Ahanu merely studied his son, his fingers tightening around the pipe. "You would bind us to them?" Takoda met his father's gaze. "The settlers are not leaving, father. Their numbers grow like grass after rain. We can fight them until there is no one left, or we can find a way to stand beside them." Ahanu's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but something deeper. Grief, perhaps. Or understanding. He took a long draw from the pipe before speaking again. "Bring them to me. Let me see this man and his daughter with my own eyes. Then I will decide." Gray Fox surged to his feet. "This is madness. The people will never accept. The people will listen to their chief," Ahanu interrupted, his voice like stone. "Or have you forgotten whose lodge you stand in?" Gray Fox's jaw clenched, but he sat back down, his hands balled into fists. Takoda bowed his head again, relief and dread twisting together in his gut. He had bought a chance, nothing more. But as he stepped out of the lodge into the fading light, the weight of his father's gaze still on his back, he knew the true test was yet to come. Because now he would have to convince Thomas to walk into the heart of the Comanche camp with only a blind girl and a promise between them and the blade's edge of war. The morning air hung thick with tension as Thomas guided the wagon along the winding trail, the wooden wheels groaning under the weight of his unease. Beside him, Lily sat straight-backed, her fingers laced tightly in her lap, her unseeing eyes turned toward the horizon as if she could sense the distant Comanche village just beyond the rolling hills. She had not protested when he told her of Takoda's request, had only nodded, her small face set with a quiet determination that made Thomas's throat tighten. She was braver than he had ever been. The rifle lay across his knees, its cold weight a familiar comfort, though he knew it would mean little if the meeting turned to bloodshed. Every instinct screamed at him to turn the wagon around, to retreat to the safety of their homestead, where the only dangers were wolves and winter storms. But the memory of Takoda's words, of the fragile hope in his voice when he spoke of peace, kept Thomas's hands steady on the reins. A shadow moved at the edge of the tree line. Thomas stiffened, his grip tightening on the rifle, but it was only Takoda, emerging from the brush on horseback, his face unreadable. He wore his hair loose today, the dark strands lifting in the breeze, and his gaze flicked from Thomas to Lily and back again. "You came," he said, as if he hadn't been certain they would. Thomas nodded once. "We came." Takoda wheeled his horse around, leading them onward without another word. The trees thinned, then gave way to open land, and suddenly the village sprawled before them, teepees rising like pointed stars from the earth, the smoke of cook fires hazing the air. People paused in their work as the wagon rolled in, their eyes wary, their whispers sharp as knives. A child darted behind its mother's skirts. An old man spat into the dirt. Lily, sensing the shift, reached blindly for Thomas's arm. "Father?" "It's all right," he murmured, though his pulse roared in his ears. Takoda dismounted outside the largest lodge, its painted hide fluttering in the wind. "Wait here," he said, then vanished inside. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Thomas counted heartbeats, each one slower than the last, until the lodge flap opened again, and a man stepped out taller than Takoda, broader, with eyes that held the weight of years and the sharpness of a hawk's gaze. Chief Ahanu. For a long moment no one moved. Then Ahanu stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. "So," he said, his voice deep as thunder, "this is the man who thinks he can walk into my camp and take one of our warriors for his own." Thomas met his gaze, his fingers itching toward the rifle. But before he could speak, Lily stood in the wagon, her chin lifted, her voice clear as a bell in the heavy air. "Takoda isn't something to be taken," she said. "He's someone to be loved." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Ahanu's eyes narrowed, but it wasn't anger in his face, it was surprise. He studied Lily for a long moment, then turned to Takoda. "She speaks boldly for one so small." Takoda's mouth curved, just slightly. "She sees more than most, father, even without eyes." Ahanu exhaled through his nose, then gestured to the lodge.
"Come.
"We will eat, and we will talk." Thomas hesitated, but Lily was already reaching for his hand, her fingers warm and sure. And as he helped her down from the wagon, stepping into the shadow of the Comanche chief's lodge, he realized for the first time in years that he was not afraid. The golden light of late afternoon spilled across the ranch yard, setting the wooden beams of the house aglow and painting the prairie grass in hues of amber and fire. The air hummed with activity. Comanche women moved between the cook fires, their hands deft as they stirred pots of savory venison and crushed dried berries into sweet paste, while settlers from the nearby town lingered near the barn, their hats clutched awkwardly in their hands as they eyed the unfamiliar faces around them. It was a gathering unlike anything the land had ever seen, a fragile truce woven together by the thinnest threads of hope. Thomas stood near the porch, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the mingling crowds. He had spent the morning helping Takoda and the other warriors erect a great canopy of hides and willow branches, a wedding arbor, they called it, its open sides welcoming the breeze and the laughter of children darting beneath its shade. The sight of it should have eased the knot in his chest, but instead, it only tightened. This was real. This was happening. His daughter, his Lily, was stepping into a world he could barely comprehend, and there was no turning back. A touch at his elbow made him turn. Lily stood beside him, dressed in a simple gown of cream-colored cotton, her hair braided with tiny blue flowers Takoda had picked for her that morning. She held a bundle of sage and sweetgrass in her hands, the scent earthy and bright. "You're frowning," she said softly. Thomas forced his shoulders to relax. "Just thinking." She smiled, her fingers brushing his arm. "About how quiet the ranch will be without me?" The words lodged in his throat. She wasn't leaving. Not truly. Takoda had promised they would stay nearby, that Thomas would always have a place at their fire. But it wouldn't be the same. The house would no longer echo with her songs at dawn, her laughter as she fed the chickens, the soft tap of her cane as she moved through the rooms. Before he could answer, a hush fell over the gathering. Takoda approached, dressed in a tunic of finely tanned buckskin, its edges adorned with intricate beadwork, a gift from his mother, Thomas had learned, woven with symbols of protection and strength. His dark eyes were steady as he stopped before Lily, his hand outstretched. "Ready?" he asked. Lily nodded, slipping her fingers into his. Thomas swallowed hard as he followed them to the arbor, where Chief Ahanu waited, his face solemn. The crowd parted, settlers and Comanche alike pressing closer, their murmurs fading into silence. Ahanu lifted his hands, speaking first in the rolling cadence of his own tongue, then in careful English for the settlers' sake. "Today, two peoples become one family. Let no man here forget what that means." Takoda turned to Lily, his voice low as he spoke words meant only for her, a vow in Comanche, its syllables like a river's current. Then, hesitating only a moment, he repeated it in English. "I will walk with you in sunlight and shadow, in this life and the next." Lily's cheeks flushed pink as she pressed the bundle of sage into his hands, her own vow spilling forth like birdsong. "I may never see your face, but my heart knows you. That is enough." Ahanu bound their hands together with a strip of soft leather, and just like that it was done. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the drums began, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to rise from the earth itself, and the spell broke. Comanche women began to sing, their voices rising in harmony, while the settlers clapped hesitantly along. Someone brought out a fiddle, its lively notes weaving between the drums, and before long, even the most reluctant among them were swaying to the music. Thomas watched as Lily and Takoda stepped into the center of the circle, their hands still clasped. Takoda murmured something in her ear, and she laughed, the sound bright as sunlight, before letting him guide her into the dance, her steps uncertain at first, then surer as the rhythm carried her. Around them, the two peoples moved together, their differences blurring in the golden light. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of violet and rose, Thomas allowed himself to believe just for this moment that maybe, somehow, this fragile peace might last. The seasons turned like pages in a well-loved book, each one leaving its mark upon the land and the people who called it home. Winter's bite gave way to spring's tender green, summer's golden heat faded into autumn's crisp embrace, and with each passing year, the ranch that had once been so lonely thrived with new life. The fences Thomas had built now enclosed not just cattle, but a sprawling garden where Comanche and settler women worked side by side, their laughter mingling with the chatter of children chasing chickens through the dust. The old prejudices still lingered in some hearts, but here, in this patch of earth where two worlds had collided, something extraordinary had taken root. Thomas leaned against the porch rail, his hands roughened by years of labor, but his heart lighter than he'd ever thought possible. Before him, the evening fire crackled, its glow illuminating the faces of his family. Lily, her dark hair streaked with the first threads of silver, her fingers deft as they wove a basket from river reeds. Takoda, his warrior's braids now threaded with gray, his strong hands gentle as he guided their youngest grandson in carving a small wooden horse. The boy's laughter rang bright and clear, his features a perfect blend of both peoples, his mother's settler fairness, his father's Comanche sharpness. Beyond the firelight, the prairie stretched vast and endless, the same land that had once felt so desolate, so isolating. Now it hummed with life. Comanche hunters brought meat to share in exchange for flour and salt from town. Settler children sat wide-eyed at the feet of elders, listening to stories of coyote tricks and buffalo hunts. The ranch had become a crossroads, a place where wounds had scabbed over and scars had faded into something like understanding. Lily lifted her head, her sightless eyes turning unerringly toward Thomas, as if she sensed his gaze. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice warm with amusement. Thomas smiled, crossing to sit beside her. "Just remembering." She reached out, her fingers brushing his weathered cheek. "The day you brought him home?" He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "The day you changed everything." Takoda looked up from his carving, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. "She has a habit of that." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the velvet sky. Around them, the night sang with crickets and the distant call of an owl, the sounds weaving into the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. It was not perfect. There were still those in town who whispered, still elders in the Comanche camps who shook their heads at the Union, but it was enough. More than enough. Thomas let his gaze travel over the faces around the fire: his daughter, her husband, their children, the friends who had become family. This was the legacy he'd never dared dream of, a future stitched together from scraps of hope, a tapestry of belonging. And as the stars wheeled overhead, their light ancient and unchanging, the wind carried with it the faintest echo of Lily's song, the same one she'd hummed as a child, now joined by younger voices, rising into the night. The end. Did this story touch your heart? Subscribe for more tales of courage, love, and the unbreakable bonds that bridge divides. Let us know in the comments what moved you most. Was it Thomas's sacrifice, Lily's unwavering kindness, or Takoda's journey to forge peace? Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Click subscribe and never miss a journey.